So this took place back in 2016. This happened to a close friend of mine named Dallas, and he was about 20 years old when this happened. He was in life skills, so basically meant he was able to stay in high school till he was 21. This is one of the moments he had that was pretty disturbing. He had autism, ADHD, and a bit of Asperger's syndrome in him. So at the time, he was with a group called Life Skills. It was a pretty special ed class for him, especially for people who had disabilities. So he and the rest of Life Skills were going to Canada's Wonderland as to kind of celebrate the last day of full classes before exams started. He loved going to Canada's Wonderland ever since he was a kid, and I'm sure everybody has. For those who live in Canada, will pretty much get the idea. Dallas was there with at least his EA named Cassia, who happened to be a pretty nice lady. Of course, since the park was pretty big, they did have to meet up, which, of course, since it was a large park, they, of course, had to meet up every few hours. Most of the time, it wasn't really a big deal since it was a big park, but however, having a lot of kids, that meant that they had to meet up at a certain waterfall near Canada's Wonderland every few hours, like maybe 3 or 4 hours at a time. This was pretty something that Dallas grew used to, but this was one moment that he would never forget. Since he was going to be graduating the next year, he was spending time with his longtime best friend, which his name happened to be Nicholas. Nicholas and him got along just fine, and since Nicholas was graduating, Dallas wanted to spend some time with him before he graduated and moved on to different stuff. However, while they were on the field trip, riding on rides, eating some snacks, etc., there happened to be something going on that was really weirding out Dallas. Dallas could see that there was a man who happened to be maybe in his late 50s, and he seemed to be walking around. He assumed at first that maybe he had a bunch of kids with him, or it could be the grandfather or something, but he didn't seem to have any kids with him. Nick and Dallas were basically in the boys' bathroom when this man showed up and asked him some questions. Of course, Dallas and Nicholas didn't even know what this guy wanted, but then he said, "Oh, I got something in my truck. You want to come with me and get it?" That is when Dallas and Nick ended up bolting out of the way. Since they were both about 6'4", they were able to push him the man out of the way since he was only 5'7". Eventually, after pushing the old man away, they reported the incident to the security and even explained what he looked like. The man was escorted out of the park, and it turns out that he had been wanted for kidnapping young adults and even teens alike. It turns out he has been doing this in other places in different countries, so he was arrested a couple times. But of course, though, he was put on probation in certain areas and certain places and wasn't allowed to be anywhere around kids. Dallas and Nick had no idea why this man targeted them, but whatever attentions that this man had probably weren't good. Still to this day, they still wonder what this man could have done if they had not burst out of anywhere and end up going towards Herd's help. Chances are something could have been potentially horrible happening, and of course, that's something that Nick and Dallas do not want to explain how it could have been the case. Of course, it's been a couple years now, and they go back to that park, but nothing like that has ever happened since, and Dallas and Nick are both still grateful for that. This took place back in 2017, or in this case, we call it the best years of the 2010s. This happened to a friend of mine named Amy, and she was in grade 7 when this took place. She, along with a bunch of her classmates, were going to this one popular camping area called Candelore. Candelore was a pretty fun and pretty big area, so it was pretty much a really good campsite. Amy loved going there, and ever since she was younger, she always enjoyed going to this campsite. She always really liked camping ever since she was a kid, and however, this camping trip was something she never expected to see, but it was definitely something she never expected to have happen to her. Now, to make a long story short, they got there on the first day and got settled in their cabins, etc. It all seemed to be pretty good. Nothing really out in the ordinary happened. However, something started to get really weirded out when the first night came along. Now, during the first night, when everyone was asleep, Amy thought she could hear sounds coming from outside. She honestly grabbed her flashlight and ended up going outside to see if she could find anybody. However, as she was wandering around, she ended up seeing what seemed to be some sort of footprints that looked like it was from a goat. Now, there was wildlife here, and at first she thought that maybe it could have been a deer or moose that passed by, but there was really nothing more to explain more evidence. She ended up looking over to her left, and she saw what looked like to be some sort of strange figure. She shined her flashlight, even though it was a couple feet away, like maybe 20 feet away from her. She looked to see that there was some sort of goblin-like creature with horns, and he was looking away from her. It honestly then took off running into the direction in front of her into the woods while letting out some quickened breathing noises. At this point, Amy was practically shitting herself, so she ended up running back to her cabin, and she stayed there for the remainder of the day. She had no idea what it was that she witnessed, but she couldn't even explain what this creature really was. However, she ended up not telling anybody, or even the camp counselors or anybody about it, fearing that she would get into trouble for sneaking out in the middle of the night. She doesn't know what this creature really was, or if it was just a man. It's really hard to say if it was a man or a woman, or possibly some sort of creature. What kind of creature had that horns with the legs and even the ears? She honestly heard some stories about the goat men, but she obviously thought that they were fake. Although she couldn't really be for sure if that's what she saw or not. Still to this day, she ever wonders what this thing really was, and still today, she doesn't even know what that thing really was, but she does not want to return to the campsite to find out. She thought this goat man person was probably just a prank, or maybe someone was trying to scare her, but she never seen anything like this again. Still to this day, she even wondered if this goat man was real. She is not returning to find out, and doesn't even want to find out if it was real or not. She still gets shivers every time she looks back on this story to this day. Nothing like this has ever happened since the rest of her field trip, but she even once in a while looks back on this, and she still wonders to this day if this thing was even real or not. She even considered telling anybody about it, but the reason why she's never told anybody was because she was afraid that maybe there was some people would think that she's crazy, when in reality, she wasn't crazy at all. For some context, this took place back in 2010 when a student who happened to be, his name was Andrew Keith, was basically taking a field trip for college to this really beautiful national forest. Now, Andrew Keefe happened to be maybe in his mid-20s, and this was a really an essential assignment for him to pass the course. It honestly was pretty neat, the forest walk. It honestly was really well made in paths and stuff. He enjoyed the beautiful natures and always enjoyed it very well ever since he was younger. He had been through some really crazy stuff. Like one time he ended up finding a real camping site in the middle of the woods that was meant for hiking and not for camping. However, that was besides the point. Andrew happened to be walking in the forest with his buddy, who happened to be Jordan. Jordan and him got along just fine, and they honestly really were both working on a project together to study some sort of plants. They were staying overnight at the forest, which I think it was somewhere in Oregon, but I can't really remember. Of course, Andrew, along with Jordan, ventured out into the forest in the middle of the fog, trying to see if they could find any plants or anything they can identify. However, as they were traveling through the forest, they ended up hearing what seemed to be like crying. It sounded like there was a young girl crying, no older than 17 or 18, and they happened to hear in the forest of what she sounded like. They ended up not stopping in their tracks, thinking that maybe there was some girl crying for help, but most of the other students were nearby, but of course they were a couple feet away, so they couldn't really tell if that was the case. Of course, this is when Andrew and Jordan decided to follow the crying, and as they followed the crying, they ended up realizing something as the crying became closer and closer. Andrew ended up stopping Jordan, and he ended up telling him that it was most likely the crying was on a loop. Something in their guts telling them that they needed to get out of there. So they ended up running back the way they came until they were near the group. Of course, they told everybody, pretty much the teachers, about that there was someone or something crying in the forest. So they alert the park rangers when they got back to the camp area. They ended up searching the whole forest, thinking that maybe there was someone missing in the forest, but the park rangers turned out that they didn't find anybody in the forest, or anyone that could be possibly lost. Even with the best description of where they heard the noise and stuff. Still to this day, they even still wondered if this was some trap to lure Jordan and Andrew into a trap that could potentially be harm to them or worse. Nothing like that has ever happened, but they don't ever plan to return to that area to find out. They still wonder to this day if this person happened to be doing this to make a sick mind to lure them into their trap. Nothing like that has ever happened since in that forest, and they still even wonder if that wasn't anyone lost in the woods. Could it be possible that somebody was trying to lure them away from the group just so they can get their hands and jump on them? They clearly don't want to know, and they still wonder to this day what could have happened to them if they had walked further into the forest. So this happened on a field trip back in 2017, and this honestly was sometime years back. It was back before I turned 19 years old, so this was in May of 2017. I was on a field trip to the museum as well as the medieval times. One of these times, however, was something that we would never forget. Well, I would never forget, at least. Most of my class never did. This happened on a highway while we were on our way, and of course it was raining on that day. But however, though, it was around 5 p.m. while we were at least 15 minutes away from being back at the school. My bus was still driving on the highway, and of course it was a pretty big coach bus. It wasn't really, the school buses, the large ones. No, it was usually the big and large coach buses. I was on there listening to my music on my iPod when all of a sudden the bus driver ended up seeing that there was someone who was pulled off onto the side of the road about maybe 20 feet or so away from them. He honestly pulled over thinking that maybe there was somebody who needed their help. So as soon as the bus driver pulled over, he ended up getting out to see if he could assist somebody. Now the bus driver on this time, we will call him by his name, Wilson. Wilson pulled over the bus to the side, and the teachers end up explaining about the situation. So when Wilson goes up to the driver and asks him for help, the driver honestly said, "Oh, my car broke down. I think the battery died. Can you see if you could boost it for me so I can get to the nearest town to fix it?" As soon as Wilson goes over to see it, he looks over to realize that everything looked fine. Everything looked intact and nothing seemed wrong. However, Wilson started to notice that something very weird was going on with this man. He looked like he had a sadistic smile on his face, and that was the cue for Wilson to get out. Wilson ended up dashing away while he took a pocket knife and stabbed the man. He screamed in pain as soon as he got back on the bus, and he drove the bus out of that area as quick as he could. Of course, he took a long way back just to make sure that he wasn't being followed. I had no idea what this man was planning to do to the bus driver Wilson, but I'm glad that he got out of that area as possible. If that man noticed something and even got Wilson in danger or whatever, I don't know what would have happened if Wilson even agreed to help fix the car, even though he did somewhat, but he had suspicions about this man. If he didn't even see any signs of suspicion about the man, God only knows what would have happened to bus driver Wilson. This comes to show you that not everybody is always going to be good.